Yeah, so I'm Jonathan Joseph. I'm Professor of International Relations at the University of Sheffield. I haven't come all the way from Sheffield. I actually live in Brussels and I commute every week. So this is like a welcome opportunity not to have to go too far to give a talk. I guess my background is more theoretical and philosophical, but I've got more and more into issues around governance and global governance. So I think I'm coming at resilience from a global governance perspective and seeing how it fits with ways in which international organizations intervene. It's very interesting how many of you are talking about risk management and crisis management, because maybe the most controversial thing I could start with saying is that in some respects I think resilience is the opposite of crisis management. So if you're doing crisis management, you're thinking, well, okay, resilience is that a tool that I can use to manage crises. And it's almost as if the main argument of resilience is that we shouldn't be managing crises. We don't do management anymore, because management is a top-down interventionist approach, which has false illusions in our ability to control systems. So this then ties in with systems approaches as well. Once we start talking about systems as extremely complex, then the issue then becomes not so much whether we can control those systems, but how we adapt ourselves to operate within those systems. And I think that's the main message of resilience that I can get across to you now at the beginning, which drives all of this analysis that I'm about to present to you. That resilience is about getting us to think in a different way about our wider environment. And so I will have a slide on the ontological implications of resilience thinking. And I'm concerned to take this in a philosophical direction. That is my own background. But I'm also, as you'll see, I'm going to combine a more theoretical approach with a focus on practice, because I do find that we can sit around. I have sat in rooms with people talking a lot about what resilience means. And it's a disputed idea, so you can talk for a long time about the philosophical ideas behind resilience. But in reality, it's what people are doing on the ground that really matters. And so it's what international organizations are doing that really counts in terms of how they pick up and use this idea. And they don't pick it up and use it in a deep, complex philosophical sense. They pick it up to justify particular practices and interventions or non-interventions. Some of you are EU experts, and I'm not an EU expert, but I find the EU an interesting organization to look at in terms of how it sees itself and how it sees itself acting. And that's half of what I'll talk about today. But I'll also talk about the British approach, which is somewhat different, which reflects another type of culture, political culture, if you like. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm mixing everything together. That's probably going to be reflected in the talk, because this is a bit of a melange, and not necessarily a good one, but we'll see how it goes, because I wanted to talk about the EU approach, but as I said, I did also want to talk about the UK approach, because, well, first of all, because I'm from the UK, so it would be useful for all of you to hear what my perspective is on that country. But more importantly, because I do think it's the leading country in terms of resilience policy making. I don't say that with any pride, but I say that just as a matter of fact. So I'll talk about that as well, but then I'll go to the bigger picture of what resilience is doing. Okay, so I'm going to see if this works. No, it's on the wrong bit. Have you done it? I've got that. My own pictures disappeared from here, but that's works. Okay, so what is resilience? It's a buzzword, and I think that you will all know by now roughly what it is, but you won't know exactly what it is. It's like any other buzzword. People use it a lot. You can even hear it on street corners these days. People, maybe not on street corners here, but in the UK certainly you hear people talking about it in everyday life. But what it actually means, I'm not so sure that people really have a great idea of what it means. They know it's a term that they have to use as much as possible, and particularly in management, you hear it a lot in our universities. I don't know about here, but in my university we hear it a lot, about making it a more resilient university, about the resilient city that we're a part of, about the resilient community that we're a part of, and that sort of thing. You can hear it a lot in EU literature, especially if you want to put in for a big money grant. Resilient cities is a big project that the EU has. I've just put in a big, we put in a cost bid together for funding for a network around resilience. So it's something, well, hopefully in our case, it's something that people want to hear about and is popular with EU. Local communities, that's big in the UK. It would be interesting to talk to you here about whether it does have the same kind of resonance in Belgium, but in the UK, there's a lot of talk about building resilient communities. When we say resilient, we mean resilient to things like terrorism, for example. So the UK's counter-terrorism strategy is heavily focused on building resilient communities that can withstand terrorism, not just terrorism itself, but also can deal with radicalization within those communities and cohere them around core values, which are part of the fight against the counter-terrorist fight. State building, disaster management, I'll talk about those as we go through. I will focus more on disaster management today in this talk. So what are the kind of main claims behind resilience? I'll go through some of the ontological background to this in a second, but I think if we start with systems theory, and we don't have to start there, we could start with psychology, which is another way of thinking about resilience, but the main literature and policy making literature tends to start with systems. And the argument about systems is that systems are not stable. They're constantly changing, they're constantly evolving, they're complex, and that we live in these unstable, complex systems. It's an interesting one to ask then, have we always lived in these types of systems, or is this a modern phenomenon? It could be argued that the world is changing, in which case that's bound up with arguments around globalization and so on, that this globalization and more complex world is something we're now having to come to terms with. It could be the case, it would be my view, that the world has always been complex and there's nothing particularly different about globalization. What globalization tells us is it's a different sort of narrative about understanding complexity. So, but that's the kind of debate and discussion which goes on about the nature of systems and then how that develops into an understanding of the type of world in which we live. Then there's the argument about ourselves and how we have to live in those kinds of systems. So how do we understand ourselves? How do we understand our own organization? How do we behave in these new complex environments? So the resilience focus itself, and there are a number of ways in which you can understand complex systems. I mean, resilience and complex systems are not synonymous with one another. Obviously, the complex system is a much broader notion. But resilience, I think, particularly focuses on one element of complex systems, which is the ability that those systems have, or us within those systems have, to survive shocks and disturbances. So, so resilience is really about how we cope with unexpected events within complex systems. How we manage those, perhaps. I started off by saying it's the opposite of management, so it's something to think about again. But it could be how we manage those shocks and threats. It's more, in my view, about how we manage ourselves in relation to those shocks and threats. It's also about how the common expression is how we bounce back from those. So given that there is a catastrophe or a disaster, how we cope with that and how we bounce back. But there are then different aspects of resilience in relation to that. So we could talk about psychological coping, trauma, resilience, and so on. Or it could be about how communities start to function again. If you look at the British government's policy making, it's very much about getting business functioning again. There's a really strong emphasis on business continuity in the UK literature, which also tells you quite a lot about societal priorities. I think if we were in Germany or in France, there might be more focus on communities and solidarity rather than just business continuity. So that again shows how resilience and bouncing back is also deeply affected by political and social cultures in which we live. And I'll say in a minute why I think the UK culture is more concerned with business continuity, is because it's more wedded to an Anglo-Saxon neoliberal model. So where did it come from? It came from systems thinking, it came from psychology, it's come from a number of areas, but in particular, I focus on the ecology literature. Resilience is a new idea in terms of policy making, but in terms of its origins, this ecology literature has been around for quite a while, from the 70s. And it entered into the political vocabulary and then started to develop notions of societal resilience to take up the issues within the communities in which we live. But originally, ecological thinking on resilience was focused on how humans adapt, as I said, within these large complex systems. And those complex systems are to do with the environment and ecosystems and so on. But then the broader notion started to look at how societies themselves are organized and how they adapt. The ecology literature takes up the issue around global environmental change, but of course you can then extend that beyond ecology to talk about other external threats and shocks that societies also have to deal with. And so the most obvious ones, and they're the most recent ones, are economic crisis and terrorist threats. You can see how 9/11 would give a new impetus to how we think about unexpected events, unexpected shocks, and how we cope with those and bounce back from those. Just as an aside, I'll forget if I don't say it now, it's not really related to this slide, but I know somebody who's doing research on the new buildings and the memorials to 9/11 in the United States. And what she found, and people were very explicit about this, the architects were very explicit about this, and the local officials who were involved in this process were very explicit about this to her, which came as quite a surprise to her, was that the memorials to 9/11 aren't actually memorials to 9/11 at all. They're actually memorials. Well, they're not memorials in a sense, because a memorial is something that's about something that happened. They're actually celebrating the resilience of people in New York. So it's not commemorating the people who died so much as it is about the resilience and the ability to bounce back and for the community then to flourish and go beyond. And that's very interesting in terms of the kind of symbolism of what 9/11 represents, and how the response to 9/11 has not been mourning so much as it has been to celebrate our resilience and our ability to go back to work and show our strong community commitments to continuation. So I just said that as a kind of aside while mentioning the terrorist threats. Of course, economic crisis is another area where there's talk about resilience. And think about that again, because 9/11, it came completely out of the blue. Apparently, nobody was expecting it to happen. Environmental events like an earthquake are unpredictable. So they suddenly happen. And we say, well, people used to say these are acts of God. You know, you can't explain them. They just happen, and then we have to deal with it. If you then apply that to an economic crisis, you can see that it's framing things in a particular way, because once you see an economic crisis as an external threat, then you don't manage it in an internal way anymore. You don't talk about banking regulation or state intervention anymore. You just treat the world economy as if it was something completely out there, which is suddenly going to affect us, rather than something in here which we can somehow control and manage. So again, it invites a particular way of thinking about the world through this resilience lens. The adaptive capacity of social systems, according to this social ecological literature, the adaptive capacity of social systems depends on the nature of their institutions and their ability to absorb shocks. So that's interesting, because now we've moved a step down the line. We've moved from discussion about systems and how to manage systems, and we've moved from that because we've realized we can't manage systems, according to this argument, to the nature of our institutions. So that's a step away from systems thinking to thinking about how the institutions in which we govern our lives, how they are capable of absorbing and dealing with shocks. So we started with systems, but we've now moved to a focus on institutions, which obviously is much closer to the policy-making world. So let me talk a bit about the ontological implications of some of this, and this is where my philosophical side comes in. But as I say, I don't want it to completely dominate, because I think that we can talk too much about some of the philosophical things without looking at what's going on in practice. But I do think that some of these ontological implications are important. I think that most contemporary social theories, and I wrote a book on this, most contemporary social theories contribute to a particular ontology that renders the world governable in certain ways. So once we start talking about complex systems, then certain ways of governing the world flow from that. If we don't think we live in complex systems, we operate in a different way. If we don't believe in globalization, then our policy making is going to be different from if we do. So most contemporary social theories, in my view, and by contemporary social theories, what I mean would be things like risk society, globalization theory, if it's still around, complexity theory, various forms of constructivism, various things that focus on I'm trying to keep up with what the most contemporary social theories are, but I think probably complexity, arguments around complexity, the post-human, post-liberalism, these kinds of arguments are quite popular at the moment. My view is that they all render the world governable in a certain way. In particular, what they all do, and this is a very blanket criticism, but what they all tend to do is to argue that the world is increasingly complex and also increasingly contingent. So they emphasize contingency. And what they mean by that is that there are no longer any relatively stable social relations out there. We've moved beyond a world based on clear divisions like class or gender or nation to a world where we live in complex networks. Each actor has their own individual pursuits, and you find that in a lot of the arguments around risk society, network society, and these types of arguments which are popular in sociology. So our social engagements no longer have any necessity to them. They are what we make of them. We read this in the works of people like Anthony Giddens, Ulrich Beck, Manuel Castells, even actor network theory like Bruno Latour and others would argue that there's no necessity anymore in our social relations. We make the world as we will through our networks and through our individual pursuits. But in order to survive the uncertainties of this new networked world, we have to show our own initiative. It's no good being passive anymore. We have to be active citizens. And we have to be reflexive agents. And so, you see lots of sociological approaches to reflexive modernity, reflexivity built into this. And that, of course, is then looking at our adaptive behavior again. And this ties us back to resilience. Because what resilience is about, again, more than anything else, is our adaptive behavior. It starts off with a liberating argument that we're not tied down by social relations anymore. We're no longer weighted by our class or by our nationality or by our gender, but we are individuals who can pursue our own interests through the complex networks within which we engage. But with that comes a heavy burden of responsibility. We as individuals are the ones who are responsible for our own survival, if you like. And that means we need to understand the complex systems as best we can in order to be able to adapt and to exist within those new complex environments, without relying on the old-fashioned approaches of the past, like class, solidarity, state provision, and so on. So I'll make my next step then. These are quick steps, I appreciate, and you can question me about this, but I would make my next step that this way of seeing the world is consistent with an Anglo-Saxon neoliberal view of the world. And we can argue about whether that exists in Belgium or not. But certainly in the UK, this is very prominent, I think, and that's why I think the resilience literature has made such strong headway in countries like the UK. Even the UK much more than the United States, interestingly enough, I would argue. So what would a neoliberal ontology mean? And I don't like the term neoliberalism. I don't think anybody does, because it can mean all things to all people. So I should always put it in quotation marks, probably, but let's stick with this for the time being, and then you can challenge me if you wish. But broadly speaking, a neoliberal ontology shifts focus, as I've said already, from a macro focus on systems to a micro focus on conduct of individuals. It moves from controlling the outside world, which is the kind of classical liberal paradigm, to what, the Enlightenment paradigm, where we try to control nature. We have aspirations for society and progress within society, to a much more, pessimistic or realistic or pragmatic view of the world, where we focus on our own subjectivity a lot more, what we do as individuals, our own individual pursuits, our own adaptability, our reflexive understanding of the world, our risk assessments, our knowledge acquisitions, and above all else, and this is a very strong normative element behind the neoliberal argument, is responsible decision making. Again, I hope you can see how this might tie up with thinking about resilience and how we cope with threats and disasters and so on. So we start with ontological assumptions about the bigger social world, but we arrive at a view where the best way, according to this, the best way to govern society is actually through greater awareness of our own behaviour. So we move swiftly from the dynamics of systems to, I mentioned earlier, talking about institutions, but then another step beyond institutions as well, to talking about individual responsibilities, individual adaptability, and individual preparedness. So I argue that resilience is actually fits perfectly with this kind of neoliberal form of governance. At least I qualify that. Resilience as understood in the UK context, because one of the things I want to open up in a minute is whether or not resilience can be understood in different contexts, in different social conditions. So let's rephrase that then. UK resilience approaches as neoliberal governance would place emphasis on things like self-awareness, heightened responsibility, encouraging initiative, again, very entrepreneurial. It's about the individual showing initiative and enterprise. Focusing on risk and security as the main ways in which we manage our lives. So we manage our life through risk now. We're constantly uncertain. We're constantly frightened about the world in which we live. We're constantly alert. And we're constantly reflective. And that's very different from managing the world through certainty and through order, and through organisation. Promoting awareness, calculation, assessment and knowledge. Creating active, enterprising and responsible citizens. And this is found in almost every single British policy-making document from Tony Blair onwards. I mean, Tony Blair and his new Labour government invented this idea of the active citizen. To give one example, in the UK, you're not allowed to be unemployed. That's definitely not allowed. To get any money at all from the state is to get money to assist you to become an active citizen. So you have to be a job seeker. That's what you're now termed, a job seeker. You have to actively pursue your own self-interests in order to make yourself a better person, a more enterprising person. The person who just sits back and receives state support is no longer wanted within British policy-making discourse. So we're talking in the case of resilience in the same way. We don't want the person who just sits back and expects the state to protect us, to look after us, to provide for us. We want the active, responsible person who's aware of the dangers that they face and they operate within their communities and develop their own mechanisms for resilience building. So let's switch completely to the international domain and look at this in relation to state building. In the state building sphere, resilience is also heavily taken up within new policy documents, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think it's also part of the same thing that I've just been talking about in the UK, which is a shift away from a classical liberal way of seeing the world based on hierarchical order, certainty, state responsibility, to a different sort of emphasis on individuals and self-responsibility. And within the international domain, there is no doubt a shift away from classical state building and intervention, which played quite a strong interventionist role in terms of dealing with conflicts and initiating institutional change and state building processes, to one which is placing more emphasis on preventing things from happening in the first place. That prevention, though, is not prevention in the sense of doing grand projects. So we don't do flood barriers anymore. We don't do things that cost lots of money. By preventative measures, we're talking about preparing people to prevent things happening to themselves, not necessarily putting lots of money into classical schemes or grand projects. So what state building is really about here is about empowering people with a sense of responsibility at local level or at societal level, rather than external agency coming in and doing things for people. And I argue that this is typical of a particular approach to governance, which operates from a distance, encouraging people through incentivization, through facilitation, if you like, whilst also lowering expectations of what Western governments are prepared to do. So there's still a lot to talk about promoting capacity building, enhancing practices and so on, but the emphasis is very much on things like good governance, good institutions, and good civil society, rather than about Western governments coming in with lots of money and engaging in grand projects. So that's a definite shift which has occurred within state building. There's still discussion about institutional capacity, but it's almost shifting downwards as you speak, from state institutions down to community institutions, down to local capacities, if you like. And there is this whole new development discourse around individual capacity for development, as in Amyata Sen's word, development as freedom. So I'm not coming out of the closet and saying at this point I'm a Foucauldian, because I'm not, but I do find some of Michel Foucault's arguments around governmentality useful here in capturing this idea of intervention from a distance, which is kind of like intervention but less direct intervention, if you like. So a shift from external exposure to internal matters of resilience. That means encouraging the governed to govern themselves. This is how Foucault would argue is about the conduct of conduct. It's about conducting us to conduct ourselves, rather than directly telling us what to do. And so resilience is being used at a number of different levels to assess institutional capacity and performance. It's encouraging us to govern ourselves, but at the same time it's monitoring that process very heavily. And we can talk about that if you want me to give some evidence of that. But it uses these various indicators to look at things like fiscal capacity, institutional strength, societal development, and so on. So let's look at the actual organizations now. Here's something from the World Bank, a very interesting comment. So I think I'll just read it and then I'll tell you what I think about it. In addition to resisting and recovering from shocks, thriving despite crisis in a changing climate also requires the ability to reorganize. This is crucial. You don't just bounce back, you've got to reorganize now. We don't go back to the way things were, we go forward to something different. And this is very important in terms of how the World Bank sees resilience, not as restoring the status quo, but as an opportunity to change things radically. To generate new ways of operating or new systemic relationships as necessary. While the starting point to understanding resilience is a clear understanding of existing levels of socio-economic vulnerability and risk management capacity, blah, blah, blah. Really, what's required is a more dynamic view of vulnerability, a more dynamic view of our vulnerability, and new ways of supporting resilience. They are diverse, long-term, and unpredictable. So all the kind of key themes are coming out here. This great emphasis on unpredictability, uncertainty, and our need to adapt, change, not to go back to the way things were, not even to bounce back anymore, because that would be the bounce back with all the old illusions in security and stability, but actually for us to embrace, if you like, our uncertainty and to change our ways of operating. Because we know what the World Bank thinks is the best way to operate. It's to become more enterprising, more commercial, more entrepreneurial, and so on. So let's look at DFID, because DFID is a key player here. So DFID is the Department for International Development in the UK, and I think it's no exaggeration to say it's driving a lot of the key policy making in this area, not just in the UK, but in the EU, in Germany, and a number of other countries, which all look to DFID for these kinds of arguments. It's not been around for a huge long time. It's set up again under the new Labour government of Tony Blair. It's recently taken up in response to a humanitarian emergency response review of 2011. It used that to argue for a more anticipatory approach to development. It used this to argue that we need to link emergency response, i.e. disaster emergency response, to longer term development strategy. This is a big term, something the EU is also doing in ECHO. It's about connecting the two together, so you don't longer just respond to every single emergency as it happens, but you try to have a longer term approach linked to development and longer term capacity building. It's about engaging with local people and institutions. It's about showing better accountability and transparency, which are very popular themes within the state building literature. And it's about a joined up approach. So if you look at the DFID documents, it's all emphasizing the need for cohesion, coherence, joined up approaches that link short-term aid to longer-term aid, humanitarian aid to disaster management, and long-term development strategy. Particularly, and this is where the UK strategic priorities come in, particularly in weak states and those areas of strategic importance to the UK. So it's not everybody's going to be helped here. It's very clear that the people who are going to get UK support are those where the UK has a strategic interest. So it's connected up with UK security strategy as well. So they picked, I won't go through this in any detail because I don't have enough time, but there's a couple of areas that the UK particularly focuses on here. One is Ethiopia and the other is Kenya. and they're picked out for very specific reasons. Britain has strategic interests in these areas. In the case of Kenya, it's an English-speaking region. They have diversified, innovative economies with strong human capacity and entrepreneurial capabilities. This is said in the resilience document, an emphasis on what would otherwise be thought of as market capacities is emphasized in a document on disaster management. So there's very much a kind of focus on political stability, capable government, pro-poor policies, sound financial management, anti-corruption initiatives, and things which the UK thinks have create opportunities, I think, if you like, for transformation within these societies. Then that links up with the UK's security strategy. So the document, very important document, Building Stability Overseas, which is jointly produced by the Department for International Development and the Ministry of Defence. This again argues that the key focus should be on fragile states, conflict-affected regions, and those areas where British interests are most at stake. Its concern is with things like resource scarcity, volatile food and energy prices, population growth, these kinds of things. And DFID's stated motivation is how best to help those countries prepare themselves to withstand shocks and disasters. So again, just think about the language here. Not how to help those countries, but how to help those countries prepare themselves. This is actually something Tony Blair said. It all goes back to Tony Blair, when Tony Blair said that the role of the state is not to help people, but to help people to help themselves. So it's the same language, I think, coming across here. The same. I'm not saying Tony Blair's had a huge influence on the world. What I'm saying is Tony Blair, DFID, and all these other organisations are part of the same discursive framework, if you want a Foucauldian way of thinking about it, I guess. But all of this is very positively packaged. It's about encouraging local ownership. It's about giving local responsibilities. Whilst the international community is extremely helpful in providing guidance and expertise and so on. So no longer large-scale resources, just guidance and expertise, training, workshops, things like that. So the emphasis, the onus is shifted onto the target country itself to do things itself. And the partners are very important. So the partners are very much the private sector. If you read the response to the review, it's very much emphasizing the role of the private sector as a doer. It's the private sector that gets things done. We need more public-private partnerships. This is also in the EU literature now. This is the best way to share risks, to encourage credit and investment, to work in what DFID calls an increasingly complex humanitarian system. So this engagement with the private sector is now taken as granted. It's a necessity which we have to engage with. So again, it connects something which would apparently, first of all, seem like disaster management to a belief in free markets and the role of the global economy as the best way of getting things done. It's about devolving power downwards, and it would look like you're devolving power down to local people, but in reality, there's a heavy emphasis on the capacity of the private sphere, as well as certain organizations within civil society. Now, I don't have a huge amount of time, probably 2 minutes or so, but I mean, I think there are contradictions in the UK strategy which come across in the document. So whilst I gave you the World Bank account, which was very much about changing things, we've got to change stuff. Your old way of doing things is wrong. USAID, the main American aid agency, is also very, very explicit about these things. It says basically the problem in sub-Saharan Africa is people are still wedded to old-fashioned kinship relations, traditional ways of agriculture and so on. They have to change. They have to become more market friendly. They have to open up to the global environment, and they have to embrace risk and be more enterprising. So very clear. They're telling people what to do. It's very paternalistic, top-down neo-imperialism, if you want to call it that. But DFID is not quite that bad. It's more open-minded. It says we're going to build on things that we're already doing. It emphasizes things here like social, institutional, and informational capacities. So it's not saying we're going to only encourage individual initiative as an alternative to communities or state institutions, but it's talking about how they work together. So I think there are more opportunities here within the DFID discourse than there might be within some of the World Bank's discourse. But that's probably because our understanding of what resilience means still hasn't really settled down. And so this is still open for grabs, up for grabs. And then very quickly on ECHO, which is the main European Union body for intervening into crisis. ECHO is a complex body. very, very complicated because it combines humanitarian intervention with disaster risk reduction and also civil protection, including civil protection within Europe as well as overseas. So there's lots of different interests competing for resources and competing for influence. And there's continual long-term rivalries here within the EU. And then just to add to the problem, we now have the European External Action Service competing with ECHO. And we also have DevCo and other DGs who all have their own particular interests. So I think there's a huge irony here. All of these organisations have turned to resilience because what resilience offers is a more comprehensive, joined up, coordinated approach. And yet at the same time, the more they emphasise that, the more we see the real institutional differences coming out. Divisions between ECHO and the European External Service, European External Action Service, divisions between short-term humanitarian response and long-term development strategy, and divisions within ECHO itself between the civil protection wings and the humanitarian intervention wing. So it's kind of interesting. Is it the case that resilience is being turned to here because it really does offer a solution to some of these differences, or is it actually going to exacerbate some of these differences, but maybe provide a language which makes it look like there aren't any problems, even though there clearly are? There's a couple of projects going on which are just worth mentioning without talking about them. One is called SHARE, which is supporting Horn of African resilience. That's doing similar kinds of things to what DFID is doing in that same kind of region we've just been talking about. Kenya, Ethiopia, of course, Somalia is the big problematic country within that region. And there's various initiatives that the EU is doing with SHARE. Again, from a SHARE document, primarily a national government's responsibility to build resilience and define political, economic, environmental, social priorities accordingly. So again, primarily responsibilizing others. It's not the EU's responsibility, it's not the international community's responsibility, it's the national government and those local communities who are responsible now for resilience. We're going to help them to help themselves, make themselves better. And then the other initiative, which I won't talk about, is AGIA, which is in the Sahel region, which is extremely problematic because there's clearly there, you can see it in the civil wars that are taking place at the moment, a conflict between the resilience approach, which is trying to encourage disaster management and so on, and actual EU member states intervening directly into that region for their own strategic interests. And it's a very, very complicated region, the Sahel, which we can talk about if people want to. But I just finished by asking, why is the EU doing this now? You can understand why the UK is doing it, because I've said the UK is the most neoliberal country in Europe. They already have all this kind of market discourse going on within domestic policy making. If you look at counter-terrorism strategy, it's very much focused on individuals, so that fits with what DFID is doing. And it's part of that Anglo-Saxon sphere, along with the World Bank, the IMF, in terms of development strategy. But why would the EU do it when the EU also talks about things like social Europe? I think it's interesting that the EU is doing this in a particular area, which is overseas policy. It's not going to try and do this in the sphere of European employment law, because then you will anger different member states and their populations who are not going to embrace this more Anglo-Saxon way of thinking about responsibilizing individuals. But you can do it overseas. It's very popular with the European population that you do overseas interventions. But at the same time, people don't really know what you're doing overseas. It doesn't directly affect them, and so they're more open to, that area of policy making is more open to this type of Anglo-Saxon approach, which is already, as I said, prevalent within the development discourse anyway. It's an age of austerity, so the EU doesn't want to spend a lot of money, but it still wants to look good, and resilience sounds good. We're doing good stuff, and it doesn't cost very much. Now, that may be, you may think that's me being cynical, but that's actually said very explicitly in all of the documents. The UK's DFID carried out a survey which said basically resilience is good because it's cheap. ECHO says the same thing. They explicitly say that in an age of austerity, resilience is the way to go. We don't do big projects anymore. We're post-classical liberalism now. We don't do large-scale state building and intervention. But the other thing I think is worth talking about is all the discourse about normative Europe and so on. Because we know the European Union wants to be a global actor, and we know also that the EU is too divided to be that strong actor in a hard power sense. but it can do soft power and it can do normative power. And resilience sounds a bit like normative power, especially when, in hard power terms, the EU states are divided over their policies towards the Sahel region, for example. You can paper over the cracks by saying, well, actually, what we do really well is humanitarian work, development strategy, resilience building. So it actually hides the weakness of European foreign policy behind this veneer of this kind of new world, this complex world where the EU is ahead of the game. It's much more complex. We're much cleverer than the Americans, aren't we? Because we do all this complex resilience building. In actual reality, the Americans are doing exactly the same resilience building projects in exactly the same regions as the EU, but we don't want to think about that too much because that spoils the picture. So I think I've rushed this, but there's a number of reasons why I think resilience building is popular within the EU policymaking circles. But does that open up any possibilities? I mean, this has been fairly, not as negative as I sometimes am, but it's been a fairly negative take I've given so far. I do think there are possibilities though. First of all, what does resilience do? It opens up the possibility that liberal peace has failed. There's been so many criticisms of the liberal peace agenda, which is to say that you employ universal liberal values across the world and that's going to solve all of the world's problems. And we know that that's not worked. We know that these large-scale interventions haven't really helped. And so at least there's a recognition that liberal peace doesn't actually help and we need to take a more pragmatic, localized approach. And what resilience does do, and we may question how serious it is about this, but it's then up to us to push it on these issues, push policymakers on these issues, is that resilience does emphasize the importance of the local context, the importance of the social, and the importance of communities. And it's a bit like thinking back to previous terms that we've used and which have probably now disappeared, like social capital. I mean, I hear it occasionally, but nothing like we used to hear about social capital. And I think resilience is trying to get at some of the same things that social capital was trying to get at. And the cynical view would be social capital is still capital, and we place the emphasis on the capital rather than on the social. But it does start to open up the door to the idea that there's something intangibly social and something intangibly human about our relationships and the way in which we cope with emergencies and disasters. That there is actually some kind of situation created by a crisis where we actually have to rely on one another and our own humanity rather than just on financial calculation or strategic planning. And so I think that aspect of resilience can be opened up and exploited by those who want a slightly different vision of resilience from the neoliberal one. And the pragmatic one could go in different ways. It could go in the direction of just being subservient to a different kind of logic, like an economic logic, or it could go in the direction of recognizing the difficulties of imposing universal solutions in the way in which the international community used to talk about these things. So there are gaps in strategy, I think, here, which do offer some opportunities. We know in the peacekeeping discourse, the state-building discourse, perhaps also in the crisis management discourse, that this new idea of hybridity is gaining strength. And again, hybridity is another notion which nobody's quite sure what it means, but it does at least recognize that whilst we can't move away from liberal aspirations of the international community, we can at least moderate those and combine those with local initiatives. So I think, to finish, there are different options here in terms of where we could go, and I end my article on this. On the one hand, we could see resilience as something completely different to the ways in which things were done before. But it's completely a new way of thinking about the world, and when you read the philosophical literature, that's the impression it creates, and I don't agree with that. I do tend more towards the buzzword type of view. However, I don't think resilience is simply a buzzword for all of the reasons I've just mentioned. I think it is addressing certain gaps in policy making and interventions. It does get at something about the social and the human, albeit in a very inadequate way, along with other buzzwords. If you look around, you also hear a lot about well-being these days. So resilience, well-being, sustainability, these are the three replacements for social capital, I think. So it's getting at something intangibly human, and it's up to us humans to make it more tangible, I suppose. But how that pans out, I think, will be a subject to political pressure, I think, and have no kind of predictions in terms of where resilience will go, whether we'll still be here in 5 years talking about resilience, or whether something new will have taken its place. But I think the context is everything, actually. The context in which policy making takes place, the context in which we live today, and the problems and the crises that we face. And that, I think, does open up a whole new range of different questions. And it also opens up new and interesting things in terms of where we're based and what we see, because I've emphasised that I think resilience discourse is very much a UK discourse, but it is making headway in the EU. It's even making headway in Germany in terms of development strategy, but it's not making any headway in domestic strategy. I don't know it's making any headway in Belgium. Be interested to know that. If so, in what areas? So that kind of contextual element, I think, is very important to look at. Not just the context within which resilience operates, but also whether there might be different local varieties of resilience depending on local political traditions, which would give me more optimism actually, because my take is very much the UK take, and I'd like to think that there are alternative takes on resilience which also might start to influence policy making in a more positive kind of way. So that's me, I think. Thanks very much.
I volunteered to be discussant. I've made a few points, mostly based on the paper. But before I start this, first of all, I would obviously like to thank Jonathan for pitching the cost you proposed in the end by saying that context is everything. So that's a research network we are trying to set up to investigate with the comparative dimension of resilience. So how is resilience framed in Belgium, in Germany, in the UK? So we hope to pick out some institutional differences in how they shape the conceptualization of resilience. Let me find my slides. I have slides actually, which is a bit pretentious. Okay. No, not okay. Okay, perfect. So I like the presentation very much because I share both views of John. On the one hand, he was very cynical initially, saying this is all about power games, all these things. But then at the end, he was sort of talking about the progressive dimension of resilience. And before presenting my case from the cynical perspective, I want to talk a bit about the research I did at King's College, where we were actually involved in setting up an emergency situation simulation with 40 public volunteers. And the project was called Preparedness and Resilience Against CBRN Terrorism. And the interesting thing is about this human dimension of resilience, that what we found, I mean, these people were basically sent through a chemical attack scenario. They had to undress, they had to decontaminate, they didn't know what was going on, the police force didn't know what was going on, the fire department didn't know what was going on. They all knew something's going to happen, and it requires decontamination, but there was no further information. So it was quite interesting for us researchers to observe what they were doing. And what we saw is sort of the emergence of group formations among the members of the public, and then some kind of partnership between the emergency responders and the members of the public in dealing with the situation. Whereas I think usually when you talk to senior emergency responders, you always have the idea of top down, we know better, we're going to guide these people very quickly through the process, and there's not going to be any involvement of the public except for being heard from through the decontamination tank. So it was quite interesting to see actually that this is, in fact, there's a lot of interaction going on, and it's not interaction in the sense of hierarchical interaction, but rather egalitarian interaction. So this resilience concept may actually help us move away from gaining a better understanding of the complexity of such situations and the complexity of social relations in such a situation. But now we come to the cynical point, my cynical point of view. So I was wondering, because you were talking about how the resilience agenda has been driven by complexity on the one hand, maybe, and on the other hand by neoliberalism. So I've been wondering whether resilience is not sort of another stage in the evolution of governance in modern society. So what I noticed in my research on risk and flood management is in the 19th century we had this idea of technical control over nature. So we try to straighten rivers and make them sort of usable for transport and the economy. Then in the 20th century, the idea of risk came up, where sort of the concept of probability came in. Technical control was less important, but we could still anticipate what's going to happen and somehow contain the damage. And resilience, at least in this ontological sense, seems to assume that the interrelations between different elements of systems are so complex that we don't actually understand what's going on. So we can't actually prevent any disasters. We can only they happen, and then we have to learn from them. So, and I'm wondering whether this discursive shift over time from security over risk to resilience has something to do with the increasing democratic accountability pressures on the state. So, because governance actors are more exposed to public criticisms, they have to increasingly manage public expectations as to what they can deliver. So initially they promise complete security, then they sort of start backing down a bit, and now they're saying, okay, we can't actually prevent anything. You'll have to adjust yourself and you have to expect a sort of a permanent state of insecurity. So is this evolution, has it got something to do with the democratization in the 21st or 19th century? And that also, I think, explains the politics of resilience, because what you were saying, I think, is that the actual root causes of the crisis, which is sort of a global capitalist system, you may say, or neo-imperialism, or something like this, that these things are beyond the possibility of being governed by the state. So, because we wouldn't want to admit that, given the democratic pressures on these governments, they're trying to deflect the blame onto local governance institutions. So again, we have the democratic pressures, and the key actors in the center, they are saying, okay, it's not us, we are sort of telling you that's the local government's failures. And finally, something that you didn't talk about, but there was in the paper, what the institutional embeddedness. I mean, you were talking about how different countries' resilience might be operationalized in different ways. But in the paper, you're actually saying that there's an audit culture and there's a lot of quantification and benchmarking sort of to be able to measure the performance against resilience indicators. And the way I understand this, you interpret this as a governance at a distance tool. Whereas what about if you sort of just, and I interpret this as part of the organizational culture of public administrations, that you have the new public management cultures kicking in, and therefore you have the quantification of public interventions, and therefore you have to, so rather than trying to link this to neoliberalism or to any economic imperatives, we're saying, okay, this is an evolution of public administration, new culture in public administration, so the actors actually have to do that. So these were the major points, and I have a few questions. On the one hand, how central is resilience in EU development and humanitarian aid discourse? Is there any evidence? Because we just take you at face value at the moment that you're saying it's very important, but is there any research that shows that it has really crowded out any alternative discourse? How inevitable is the choice of resilience for the EU? You're arguing that there are certain institutional reasons why they're adopting it to project a positive image. Are there any alternative discourses? How about the US and China and other blocs involved in crisis management? Are they adopting resilience as well, and why? And do you have any ideas? What are the alternatives to the resilient discourse? So that's
Thanks. Do you want me to sort of try and address some of those? I don't know if I can. I could just say it's too complicated and I'll just adapt myself. But the resilience agenda is driven by complexity and so on, and is this a new stage in governance? And I think it's yes and no.
Because I think there's two elements there. One is the idea that there's a stage, and the other is the idea of governance. So I'd argue that yes, you can say that it's been stages, if you like, from this kind of Enlightenment attempt to control and to have full security, to this, 20th century emphasis on risk, to perhaps resilience as the next stage in recognizing that we can't control anything anymore. But how you analyze that, I think, depends on whether you want to place emphasis on the broader discourse or on the practices themselves. And I guess I mean, this is a contradiction in Foucault's work. Some people could read Foucault saying there's a really deep-rooted discursive shift taking place here, and I think the work of David Chandler does this in resilience thinking, where he says there's been a fundamental deep-rooted shift in the way in which we think about the world. And I don't really agree with that. I think there's rather been a shift in the practices at a more surface level. I'm not sure if there has been a deeper-rooted change, but the practices create the impression that they have, but maybe it's just the practices that are changing. And if it's just the practices, then this is perhaps more short-term than some sort of deeper-rooted thing, which is why I've always been suspicious about the Beck-Giddens arguments about risk society, reflexive modernity, and so on, as if these are some kind of deeper change in the underlying conditions of modernity itself, rather than changes in the way in which we govern the world. And so I like the Foucault that talks about the changes in the way we govern, precisely as to counterbalance that kind of deep-rooted epistemic shift that other people try to talk about. But maybe you're right that there is this kind of broader issue going on here, which is the impossibility of governing everything, and therefore we have to change the expectations in line with mass democracy of what we can expect and so on. But it is also a more political thing, and this is where I think the strategies of governance come in again, because yes, you can manage public expectations, but you can also shift those public expectations, and there has been a shift, certainly, away from what the public can expect in terms of social welfare provision, employment, and so on and so forth, deliberately away from that and towards this view that we're always in an uncertain state based on the uncertainties of the market and the environment, which is just a natural thing that we have to learn to live with. And that's been a very conscious political strategy associated with neoliberalism or ordoliberalism or whatever variant it's had across Europe and the rest of the world. And I would say that I don't think it is absolutely a shift away from large-scale management, because when something big happens that does affect the key players in the game, they show that they're perfectly prepared to manage things and to have a major intervention. The biggest intervention that you could ever possibly imagine took place with the financial crisis, and the amounts of money which were suddenly found available to manage that crisis. And yet with resilience in the environment, it's presented as if we don't have the resources to manage these crises. When it's the economy, apparently we do. But we all pay a price for that, but we're all in it together, aren't we? That's the discourse. So I think that's a deep political set of priorities there. And I'm not denying, I think you're right, that there's been this broader shift in deeper structural processes of demographics and citizenship and democracy and what's possible and so on. But I also think there's a big role here for the role of political strategies and shaping how we see our priorities. The root causes are beyond governance. That's the discourse which creates this set of strategies which then follow from it. It's about, as you said, deflecting blame onto others, for example, local government. And that's not new with resilience. That's been going on for a long time. I mean, the archetypal example of that is the failed state discourse. States fail because they are bad states, not because they're part of the global inequality or poverty and so on and so forth. So we blame the Somali state for the crisis in Somalia rather than the global system. So that's been going on for a long time, and you can see how that would logically then extend to resilience, because if a state can't cope against natural disasters, it's the fault of the state and its coping capacities, not the fault of the international community for supporting the system that creates these kind of power inequalities in the first place. And the EU can claim to be doing that whilst also signing various trade agreements, which make the situation worse for most sub-Saharan African states. The point about the embeddedness in the audit culture is something I really need to think about here, because I think I probably agree with you that it's not just a matter of auditing from a distance. I think the two go together. What we do is we govern from a distance. So rather than me directly telling you all what to do, in an ideal world, I could just get you to audit yourselves, and then you can do peer review, and I can go home.
And when I come back, you'll all still be auditing one another and governing yourselves. And that's me governing from a distance. I can go to Sheffield, and this will carry on. And I come back next week, and you've all been governed from a distance. But it relies on auditing. But your point is that also that there's more to it than just governing from a distance. There's this whole auditing culture here, which is, maybe more of a Weberian take on bureaucracy, but deeply embedded culture, albeit one that's moved away from the Weberian hierarchical system to one which is more networked. And I do agree with that. I think that this is a deeply pervasive culture, although believe me, it's far worse in the UK than anywhere else. And almost every day we have to monitor and assess our performance at almost every level. That's just in academia, I think, where it's probably most advanced, that whole culture. As I write this paper, I'm writing it not thinking I want to write the best possible paper, but writing it thinking this is going to be audited by the next research assessment exercise, and I've got to get it out in the right kind of publication, the right kind of journal, so it mustn't be too long, it mustn't say anything controversial, it must be citable in X, Y, and Z ways, and I'm constantly monitoring my own behaviour and writing things according to that culture. So I think that's a deep-rooted culture, whether it's happening from a distance or whether it's more deeply ingrained in the way in which we do things. It's probably a mixture of both, but I think there's definitely a book to be written on the audit culture. I mean, I know Michael Power has written a fantastic book on the audit culture, but something that kind of takes up that kind of deeply embedded institutional nature of audit, I think would be quite useful. And then how central is resilience in this whole project of humanitarian aid, and is it necessity? I think it was in the right place at the right time, the idea of resilience. I don't think there's anything that says it had to fit that particular box, but it did fit it very neatly at that particular moment in time. And as I said, it fitted very neatly with this Anglo-Saxon neoliberal, quasi-neoliberal discourse. It fitted it very well. Whether we'll still be here in 5 years talking about that or something else better will have come along, well, let's see. It probably, the next thing that will happen is resilience gets divided into its various different strands and aspects, and it'll be fine-tuned and so on, before we realise that it's actually the wrong word. But I think it is very, very, very central at the moment, because it's about recalibrating development strategy. It's about recalibrating emergency response in a particular way, which places more responsibility on local actors. And resilience, I think, is very good at doing that, whilst also sounding very positive, because it's also empowering people. We all want to be more resilient, because the opposite of resilience is death, isn't it? If you're not resilient, you don't survive. So we all want to be resilient, and we all want to be helped to be more resilient. But it's actually about making us less capable of controlling the bigger picture, or trying to stop us from wanting to control the big picture. We just got to let it go, the big picture. Forget about controlling the global economy, about the global environment and all the things that the ecologists are telling us, and just concentrate on ourselves, which is the archetypal neoliberal mentality, isn't it? That you just think about how well we're doing and forget the bigger picture. But I do think that is mixed with various other trends in development strategy. I mentioned Amartya Sen's work on development as freedom, which is a very individualistic approach to development. And I think that this is very strong in World Bank thinking at the moment, IMF thinking and so on. How other blocks do this? Well, the US bloc does do it like that, but I think that the UK has that deeper embedded culture. So to go back to your point about audit, I think that audit culture in the UK is more embedded than it is in America. Albeit, as you said, I think it's also not just about managing expectation, but also, citizens will want to blame somebody if things go wrong, and we don't want to have lots of lawsuits and so on. So that whole legalistic framework has also been very strong in the UK and the US. But as for China, well, that will be interesting. I mean, we're already seeing this kind of the Beijing consensus alternative to the post-Washington consensus. And that will be very interesting to see whether China takes it up. I know that there's about 5 or 6 books on Chinese governmentality out there, which try to argue that similar things are going on within China, and possibly you might start to see conditionality and expectation attached to Chinese aid. But it's not got to that stage yet. I think China's got to go through its own internal development first before it can start to become more neoliberal, if you like. I mean, it believes in the market economy, but as I've tried to argue here, I think implicitly, neoliberalism is much more than just a belief in free markets. It's about a particular way of thinking about individual responsible conduct. It's for me more akin to a way of governance, a mode of governance, than it is about just simply promoting the free market. It's about creating the conditions within which a market logic can operate. So whether China can actually do that, I'm not sure. I think ideally they probably want other people to do it for them and then benefit from that regime in the short term. But I'm not sure how that would work. It's well beyond me to try and comment on that. And as for the alternatives, that's where I kind of open it up to you, I think. And you can tell me, is there an alternative Belgian view on resilience, which is more positive than the one I've just presented?